thank you very much for being here. I should have asked you how you can calm down before a presentation, because, yeah, they're shaking. So we're going to talk about Planet Coaster and the audio we did for it, and hopefully you can take something home from what we've done. And I'd like to start with kind of how we made this game. For a fairly big game like Planet Coaster, we had 3 stages. We had a pre-production stage, and it lasted about 4 months, and we had 1 coder and 2 sound designers on this full-time, and a production stage and pre-release. This was about a month and a half before we actually released, and production was over a year. So it's a fairly big project. And a project like that, in pre-production, you start thinking about systems. You start thinking about what is this game we're making and what is the game the other people are making. You're constantly talking with other departments, which are also equally small at that point in time, and they're trying to figure out how to do this game. And as you go from pre-production towards production and release, the amount of systems you're making, it becomes less and less, but you're always still designing in systems, at least in a project like this. And you don't even end at pre-release. So it says release there, it should be pre-release. You kind of design these systems with, okay, this system is too big to do in 1 game. Let's spread this out over 2 games, or maybe even 3 games, and build kind of little parts of this as you go on. And both these things, systems and breaking down systems into smaller parts, that's kind of what this whole talk is about. And of course, you also have asset creation that starts somewhere at the end of pre-production and just ramps up until you're in pre-release. And then there's also this very important point where you start, where you just have to think about presentation and can't think about systems or assets anymore. It's about, okay, let's just finalize everything and start thinking about how this game is being presented. Pre-production, you analyze the game you're trying to make. Production, you think about creation. You also test if all the things that you thought about in pre-production actually work and refine if needed. And then pre-release is about presentation. But all these 3 phases are also about communication. Always talking to other people, always kind of thinking about what the audience needs and iterate on what you have. So you don't do that on your own, obviously not. We have a fairly large audio team at Frontier. It's 16 people in total. And on Planet Coaster, this is the team that we worked with. And one of the really cool things that we have at Frontier is that Jim Croft, our head of audio, he's kind of ring-fenced audio coders. We had 3 audio coders on the project full-time, and even a 4th one, Steven, who is also a sound designer. So he did the whole music system and created musical ambiences. It could do all those things together. And we also have a dedicated audio QA, somebody that constantly looks at the quality, the state of the mix, the implementation, if everything is running well still. And that's also important on a project like this, because, as you said, it's open world, it's a free-moving camera, and all of those things are really, really hard to control, because you can never predict what's going to happen. For those of you that don't know, Planet Coaster is a theme park simulation game released on PC, and you create, manage, and share your own theme park. And it's set in an open world, so it means it starts with nothing and it ends up with possibly everything. And in between, there could be very dense areas or very spread out areas, and all of those things create different soundscapes. So for us, that meant that the park that people create has to inform the audio. You can't just play a background loop with a crowd in it, because somebody may have decided to just not have any crowds in a park, and you can do that in Planet Coaster. And because it relies so heavily on user-generated content, we can't pre-calculate anything. We do have an obstruction occlusion system, and this has to be real-time, because the hill that's there a minute ago might be gone, might now be a tunnel. And the user-controlled camera adds all of this extra complexity. The transitions are instantaneous. It flies through everything at very great speeds. And because all of that wasn't enough yet, there was also no limits on building. The frame, you can build this game until it runs at 1 frame per second, and then your audio still has to be performant. At least it can't crash. I see Will saying, don't say that, because it might not actually work that way. But actually, the game does at 20, 15 frames per second. We tested this, really low spec machines. The audio keeps running. And part of that is because we thought in systems rather than kind of just implement everything that we see on the screen. Now, a theme park that one of our users has built looks a little bit like this. And if you look at this kind of open plan area, we thought about this in pre-production. We didn't know they would build this, but we thought they would. And you can see there's loads of rides here. And there is a pointer on this, isn't there? Yeah, actually. So there's a ride here on the back, which is a drop tower. And when a drop tower in a real theme park drops, you can hear the screams all over the place, and you can hear the mechanical sounds of that. And in pre-production, that was something where we said, we want to hear that. And we also want to hear the coasters, and we also want to hear that crowd that is now 4,000 people strong. So how do you do this? You go closer in, the detail increases. There's this kind of ride that has music on it when it starts and stops, and that coaster on the background. It just went over a hill, so you want to hear the people screaming there. And then there is this group on the left, and they're all congested, and you want to hear that being different from the group in front of you that's much smaller, and the group on the right of you that's bigger again, and then there's mascots running around. And if that's not enough, in Planet Coaster, you can go even closer to what you're seeing. And here you see people emote. There's a guy on the left that is obviously not very happy with the theme park that was being built. So he's upset. He's going to make an upset noise, or at least an upset gesture. Can we get sounds on those as well? And in pre-production, we had no idea what the end result would sound like. So I can do a little jump into the future here and give you an idea of the sound of Planet Coaster. What I won't do is talk through any of this. So all the information is in a top bar, and it explains what you're seeing. So that gives you an idea of the things we were thinking about in pre-production. And the thing that was always at the center of all these thoughts was the crowd. In Planet Coaster, the crowd is much larger than we ever had it on a game like this. In fact, it can scale to 10, 15,000 people. And it also does a lot more things than it did in previous games. It can congest, can queue, form groups. all these things that we thought it would have to represent if you're talking about a crowd that is the representation of the park that you've built, and the crowd really reacts very kind of detailed way to whatever you've done in the park, then it has to sound that way as well. And we've done a couple of dev diaries, and I won't play you all the dev diaries because that would be boring, but there's a little part from the crowd video that we did, and it's interesting for two reasons. One, it explains the crowd really well, and second, it shows you a couple of the other people that helped us out so much in doing the audio work.
The basic goal was to have crowds that were more believable.
So people far cleverer than me will tell you exactly how this is working. But traditionally, certainly in sim games, people don't matter, so we'll take shortcuts and we'll let people walk through each other. And it looks ridiculous. You stop believing in people.
So we've designed a new kind of algorithm. It's more like a fluid simulation. It's dynamic. So it's like, imagine two sets of particles trying to go in different directions. When they meet, they form into lanes, and then they move past each other and potentially form mini vortices. And that means that you're planning the route for everyone at the same time and not planning each person's route individually.
And for us, that's a really interesting quote, because what Owen did is, to get the level of detail for an individual, he had to think of the group as a whole. And around the time when he was designing this fluid dynamic system which runs the crowd, we got a sit down with Andrew Chappell, the lead programmer on the project, and he sat us down and he said, look, the traditional way you're doing audio, you can't do that on this project. And this was in pre-production, and this was actually really good because it forced us to rethink our traditional approach. And for those of you, you're all sound designers, so I can probably skip through this very quickly. But traditional approach is you got loads of sound objects in your world, and then they all have kind of a distance assigned to them, and then you look for the objects that are in range, and those that aren't in range you throw away. Now the problem with Planet Coaster is there's a lot of objects to go through that might or might not be in range. So after a certain while you run into a problem that the amount of time it takes to just look for the objects in range exceeds the amount of time you have to actually make them do a sound. So we had to think of something different. That one-to-one relationship, an object with an emitter on it, and then basically looking at animations to see what sounds to play, that wouldn't work. And the other problem with that is, well, if you're looking for stuff in a certain range, you can't look for stuff outside that range. So that system couldn't do kind of distance either. And well, with the camera and with all those objects, we'd have to fix kind of mix problems, transition problems. So we turned that around a little bit. And one of the really helpful things in this was, these days we all have a camera and a microphone with us in our phones, and they're super helpful for kind of getting a sort of what does reality sound like. And in Cambridge there's always a crowd to be found, so there was a crowd on this particular day, and I recorded it at different distances to get an idea of what a crowd sounds like at these kind of different distances that we were thinking about in the theme park. And pay attention to how much of the Foley, the footsteps and the kind of things that would be loud in a film are actually loud in reality. So obviously not the best microphone in the world, but it does give you an impression of this. And the interesting thing about this was that the Foley, the kind of amount of footsteps you can hear, or even the football being hit, so you can hear a little bit of it, and on headphones it's clear, but it isn't that important until you get really close to these objects. So if that is true for reality, and we have this problem about having too many objects to track, how much should we actually care about sync? And isn't an informed impression more than enough if you're just describing something at distance? So all of that is about one-to-one relationships. Where do you need them and where don't you need them? And for us that was very freeing, because the moment we stopped thinking about sync, which is always this thing about sound designers, we always think about sync and movement and weight and what we're trying to kind of express, we could think of a lot of things of solving this problem about having too many objects. And that contextual impression, that was what kind of made us think in a different direction. Traditional approach doesn't scale, but how about a contextual approach? Instead of looking at all the people in my park, which is continuously growing, why don't we look at a fixed space in my park? And if we define a fixed space, we could maybe derive an impression from it. And this was the great thing about being in pre-production, and people like Owen and Andy Chappell. Owen already had this kind of fluid dynamic system, and it was a big grid. And we could talk to him and say, can you make part of this available for us in audio? Because we were really interested in it. And he did some work, and he made us a grid. And what we do is, well, he basically made the grid available to us. This is our audio coders that still did the work. What we do is we count a grid cell, and we say, oh, there's 2 people in this grid cell. And we count another one. Oh, there's 4 people in total now. And then over the course of an entire frame, we spread out this work, and we count all the people that are in the entire grid. And that system is called the crowd soundbox. Now, what that does is it interprets data. It has this data about people in the world. And when it has that, it can kind of create an impression from this. And the way we do this is we have 4 directions around the camera, and we say, create me an impression to the right, to the left, front, and the back. And then create an emitter where it's needed, and map the amount of sound that's needed there on the emitter. That's how we kind of do these crowds. It's an impression of crowds, and it works really well. You turn the camera around, these things turn around. So even though you're only getting information once every second, the emitters are updated every frame. So yeah, they're always a little bit out of date, but for an impression, it's really great because it's performant, and we have only 4 emitters that we need. We distribute the work over multiple frames. We have manageable assets because we're talking about an impression, so we don't need millions of lines. And it mixes really well as well. Hurrah! But there's a couple of cons. One of it is that it is indeed an impression. So you can't do people walking past the camera. You have a little bit of lag. You have to work around that. And it still only has a maximum range. If we make that grid larger, it takes longer to count through all these cells. So for us, that 200 by 200 was the ideal kind of compromise. And yeah, if your frame rate goes down, then it still takes 30 frames to count through all of it. So at a very low frame rate, your lag does indeed increase. But it's one of those compromises we have to take to kind of deal with this problem of scale. So we needed something more to kind of fill in that distant layer and that kind of one-to-one relationship where this system doesn't do what it needs to do. And that's where layers come in. If we go back to that image we had before, this view, the soundbox is really good at. It'll put an emitter on the left and it'll say, that's a congested crowd, make it sound like a congested crowd. It'll put one right in front of you and say, it's less busy, so play a less busy asset. And there's one on the right of you, which is busier again. And we use the rule of 3s there. It's all small, medium, large, because that works really well and it keeps the asset count down, doesn't hurt us in the memory department. But on the left top, the individual animations, the crowd soundbox can't do that. And on the right, that kind of far away view, we can't do that either with the crowd soundbox. So we did a lot of thought experiments in pre-production, like, okay, if I had the camera all the way up in the park and I go down, what does it sound like? And we also got a little bit philosophical with this in thinking, yeah, well, in a game like this, what is the player actually? Is it the camera? Is it the crowd? Is it the progression of building your park? Because in previous games, like in Elite Dangerous, you design all your sound design around the ship, or you design it around the weapon or around the main character. But in this game, we didn't have that strong kind of relationship, but the crowd is kind of an impression of the park, and it's a really great thing to mix around. So we thought if we change our approach, and rather than put a lot of detail on the foreground and finding ways of managing that, why don't we design from a background that's always there and a medium layer that's always there when you need it, and add the detail through systems when and where you need it. And in a scene like this, the faraway view, we only have a backdrop, which is a loop, but it's informed by the amount of crowd in the park. So if there's no crowd in the park, you won't get any of that sound. But it's very kind of diffuse and it's very quiet in the mix. So we can get away with it. If you get to a view like this, which isn't quite a close-up, but it's close enough to hear people go past the camera, we use the soundbox for the medium view. We also have a soundbox that just collects those 4 emitters and places one big emitter that kind of represents the 200 by 200 grid. And we have close-up emitters for conversations. Now, the reason why we can do that is we already looked where the people are. So for the cells closest to the camera, we can actually say, okay, and who are these people and what are they doing? Which is super expensive, but we're only doing it for a subset that we we've already calculated in a cheap way. And that lets us kind of bring in and out systems where we need it in the game. So with the contextual impression and layers, the combination of those two, we get really good transitions as the camera moves very quickly through your park. And it might sound a little bit like level of detail, but it's more the opposite, because we're not adding a lot of detail to an individual object. We're kind of turning on systems that add the detail where we need them. And each system is optimized to be cheap or manageable. It helps with our scaling issue. It enables us to do these really quick camera transitions. And the nice thing is that it sounds really good as well. Once we had this system in place, it formed the basis of our mix. And we mixed everything around the crowds that are in the park. So I've done a camera movement through the same park we've been looking at. It's in debug mode, so it performs really badly. But it gives you an impression of what the work the soundbox is doing. The yellow grid cells, that's the soundbox, and there's these white kind of pies. And the less they look like a Pac-Man and the more they look like a pie, that's how many people are in a cell. And you see that close 4 and close 1, that's the kind of emitters that are placed around the camera and being updated frame by frame and get different kind of assets applied to them as we get new information in. So that is how we did the crowd. And once we had the crowd in place and had a way of working with the crowd, we started to apply this kind of bespoke solution way of working to every other area in the game. And an interesting thing is once you start dropping the idea of lag, you can think about kind of performance in very different ways. You can think of level of detail. You can have something be just in the background, or it's a medium level of detail or close-up, or it's really expensive. Or you can think of level of sync. We have things that have absolutely no sync, all the way to things that are completely real-time, or in levels of expense, so cheap or balanced. And this park that you see here, there's different camera angles. All these are different ways of looking at that with those terms. So you can think of the amount of detail you have in the close-up, or the amount of sync you have in the middle screen, and that results in kind of in real time, these things, as you move through the park, these kind of things change, these systems change, and they do different things. And because we have different systems doing the different layers of each individual thing and on each individual position of the camera, you get a really balanced system that mixes well and is performant in an open world and with a camera that moves at insane speeds. And we have many soundboxes that do different things. We have a music one. It traces the 3 closest rides to you and really nicely transitions from diegetic to non-diegetic music and back again where it's needed. We have a pooled soundbox for coasters. Coasters use the traditional ways, attenuation, so range-based. But to keep that performance, people will place 100 or 200 coasters in a park. We look at the closest to the camera, and we have systems to transition between which is now the closest. So at the end of pre-production, we had a system and a way of working, and it translated to an implementation in Wise as well, where we broke things up in the appropriate layers. And what we really did was talk to other people. What are you building? And how does that need sound? And how can we kind of combine our work with your work? What can you do for us? Then we get the information we need and build our systems around this. And it wasn't until we made the trade-off, until we say sync might not be necessary everywhere, that we could actually think about not putting an emitter on each individual person. And of course, it's all about talking to other people. As sound designers, we often come in a situation where we want something and some other department says, we're too busy, we can't help you. So the earlier you can talk to other people, and Loic had a really good talk about this, trying to find where he is. But excellent, that is just blew our minds. It's like we're living in the Middle Ages compared to what your guys are doing. So this is a very, very good talk. Thanks for that. This is like, I feel like we're at the first step, and you're giving us a template where we should go in the future. And it is really important to always communicate and talk to others. So let's go from pre-production to production and give you a couple of examples from the game and how we solved these examples. And one of the really fun ones is the amount of screaming you do on a ride. And this makes me immediately think of Hugh's talk. When we had a previous game that had some screaming on rides, we asked people to scream for as long as they possibly could, because the ride had animations on it, and on some rides that people built, these animations were just almost continuous. And asking an actor to scream for as long as they can means they probably fall down at some point. So some people said, we'll never do this again, because this is just too stressful. And so that is something we wanted to fix for this game. There was a really fun solution that they came up with, is the gasp solution. So if somebody screams for an X amount of time, they'll do a little, and then they scream again. But it's kind of a stopgap solution to a problem that shouldn't have happened in the first place if we had more time in pre-production to work with other departments. And on that project, the time just was not there. So we know what worked, we know what didn't work, and we built on that experience. That's really nice if you can make multiple games that are kind of similar. And you all know this, very often things that work visually very well, you put a sound on it and everybody says the sound is wrong. Well, no, the thing that triggers the sound is actually wrong, because now you can hear how repetitive what you've built is. And no, nobody has that problem, right? So that is something we constantly talk about to the animation department and to others. And because we've been building bridges from the start of the project, they're very receptive to it. Nobody does that on purpose, but it just happens. So there too, we went for a systematic approach to screaming. If you think of occasions more rather than, okay, there's screams and let's record a load of them and make loops and start and stops and gasps, we think of, okay, can we break them down into kind of smaller pieces? Have varieties of lengths, very important. And we also started thinking of level of detail. There is that tower I talked about earlier when it drops and you want to hear those screams all over the park. Well, we have a system for that basically collects those moments, puts them in a list, and puts an emitter on that object, and always ever only plays 2 of those. So it creates kind of this ebb and flow through a park of screams. And we call those ride moments or hero moments or 11s, and that works really well. So you record that differently and implement that differently from a generic excitement layer on a ride that goes out very far. And then on each cabin we have a layer as well, because people on one cabin might be, they have fun in it, and the other one are terrified. And then you get this really nice kind of balance of fun, terrified, and it gives you a great sense of space and movement. And that's all driven from the guests themselves. So James Stant, one of our sound designers, he started thinking about the system. He also designed a language specifically for this game called Planko, which has over 7,000 words now. And he did something really clever. He used English and replaced all the words in it. So we didn't have to think about creating an entirely new language. It's just that he replaced words for it. And he did a really amazing job on it. Meant we could have conversations in the park. And because they're not in English, you don't hear so quickly that they're repetitive. It's more of a sound design thing than it is. But they're actually talking about what's happening in the park. So if you learn the language, you can understand it. And not going too deep into it, because this is a talk on its own, but he wrote an article that went live today on Game Sutra. So you can read all about Planko in there. So James Stant thought of a system, and he looked at the rides that we had at that point. It was a forge and a drop tower. It wasn't that many rides, but he thought, okay, what is the kind of signature move of this ride? And on one ride, there's these arms that go up and then they fall down. And he's like, oh, that's kind of, there's an initial scare and then there's laughter. And he made all these kind of blocks of screams or excitement or laughter or even murmurs and conversation. And with that in hand, he had the building blocks to start populating the rides. He could just say, okay, on this ride, on this moment, we have an A and a C and a B, whatever he thought of first. And again, that's having kind of a system to approach production makes it much easier in production to kind of scale up and do loads of rides. And that's because the way he implemented that on rides, his rides are completely predictable. They are driven by animations. People can change sequences and they can make rides longer and shorter, which means that the people on it change their values as well. Somebody who's really excited, they might get very bored, and somebody who's scared might go from scared to being excited and bored. But we track all of that, and then we play kind of the appropriate samples for that. So we say there's a drop here, but then we look at, okay, how many people are actually scared or excited, and play the appropriate sample for that. And because he had the system, he could do this for loads and loads of rides quickly. It takes him half a day to do a new ride, which is really nice. And because we had this system, we were talking to other departments about it and found out that animation had exactly the same problems with their animations and rides. They too thought that the people didn't look very convincing if all they did was screaming. So they were thinking about an approach. We put our heads together, got a game coder in, and they designed us a system that kind of drives both animations and our stuff to create a more kind of convincing approach to crowds. And the thing is, because we had the system in place, we could design a rule set that also works on coasters. Coasters are completely free-form. People can do whatever they want on them. So we needed that to work as well. I've made another video, and I hope it kind of proves that it works really well on coasters. The art style is quite amazing. So, game called Planet Coaster. There is some point where you have to talk about coasters, I guess. That too, with coasters, we knew that these would be, in a cinematic sense, the most important part of your game, because people build their coasters and then they go ride them, and that is like absolutely fantastic. So we knew that we wanted them to sound fantastic as well, if we could do so. And one of the ways you do that is by making your loops reactive and using kind of data driven from your game to make them more interesting. And you can't just record a coaster and put a pitch on it and just have that go around the track. That was fun 10 years ago. We couldn't do that in this game. So again, we wanted the park to inform the soundscape and be reactive to what people do, were kind of the rule set we had at the start of the game. So in this case too, we had to find a way to make our loops more reactive. And then there's also our coaster heads, which is this worldwide fan club of coasters, and they really know everything there is to know about these. They know that the coaster changed its sound from one year to the other because an environmental rule set made them put different wheels on a coaster, and now it sounds entirely different. Or they put sand in the inner tubings to make it more silent. And there's a certain level of OCD that you can go into with this. Just time-wise and asset-wise as well. But we tried to really do kind of different materials and different styles, and this is something Loic said as well. The first thing we did was make one really cool coaster, then make it wooden, metal, and rattly, kind of modern and old school, and then we started, okay, we have these layers, we can do different things on the individual layers, or maybe even on this coaster, which is a specific manufacturer, B&M gets mentioned a lot, has a certain B&M roar, we put a B&M roar in, everybody happy. So the real other problem with this is users make the craziest tracks. The first track everybody builds is something that goes straight up into the air until you can't go any further and then spirals down and ends. And that would kill everybody on board. But it also just goes fast. All it does is go at top speed, and that is really boring. So we were thinking about, okay, can we do kind of pre-calculate the track and say this is the fastest speed and then kind of normalize the values in between that? And no, we can't pre-calculate. So we did something the other way around. We have a speed from 0 to 25 meters per second. And as soon as you go over that, if it's 26, we start compressing the values that come in. And it's 27, we compress it 1 to 2, and it's 28, we compress it 1 to 3. So you have your range in the low end where kind of the coasters are the most reactive. And if they go really fast, you're kind of recompressing the entire scale based on how fast it's ever gone on your track, which we can do in real time. And if you change the track, that still works. So there's a lot of interesting things you can do if you start thinking about compressors on data and RTPCs. One of the things we did to get a start on was get really good source. We hired this guy called Watson Who, and some of you might know him. He's a recordist, works in the US. And we called him up and said, can you record a theme park for us? And he said, jolly, yes, I can. And 2 weeks later, he had found us a theme park, and he said, we can close it for 2 days. So he got to ride all the rides by himself. And the most important thing to take on this, he said, is nausea tablets. Not even microphones, apparently. So that was fantastic, because we got these really clean rides and these fantastic recordings for rides as well. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have Michael Maitland and James Stant being very unkind to Michael's bicycle. They took off the wheel at the end and just used the rim and little wheels on the rim to create kind of these track noises. So that end of the spectrum, we kind of create our own sound design. We have these amazing kind of sources. And what I then did for about a month, I think, is just figuring out how to go from What's in Who's recording, which he gave to us, finding a video of that same coaster online and syncing them up, which worked perfectly, and then trying to kind of figure out what's happening in the recording and what am I seeing visually, and just kind of deconstruct his recording. Again, Loic, you've done a great talk and talked about everything we're talking about as well, is kind of you prove your systems in video first. You prove them linear, because if you can prove them linear, you have iteration cycles, and yeah, you also have your material for videos, which is fantastic. And I've broken them up in track, wind, car sounds, clunks, and just started adding things until I got something that sounded a little bit like the bass recording we had. And what we do a lot is, and this is a technique that Joe Hogan, the lead on Elite, kind of pioneered, is he did the ship design for all the ships in Elite. And all these ships fly through the blackness of space constantly. So it's actually really boring. You don't get a sense of what the ship is doing. So what Joe did is every little thing you do is reactive. And we did that as well with the coaster. So we use a lot of data that we get from the game to kind of change how these loops sound and make them more interesting. And I've recorded a little bit from Wise, which is our audio middleware, which shows you kind of the emitters and the events coming in and the RTPCs as they control the layers. And on the background, you hear the coaster going around the track. So we use things like acceleration and velocity and horizontal acceleration, vertical acceleration. And this is one of Watson's recordings put into RX. And one of the things I really struggled with at the start of doing these coasters was I was using pitch a lot, because we're using pitch a lot on Elite Dangerous. And the thing about using pitch on Elite Dangerous is that we had to have very clean samples, because you don't want to be pitching a kind of very frequency-rich sample up and down. You get all sorts of problems in the mix. So on Planet Coaster, doing this kind of pitching doesn't quite work, because that's not what a coaster sounds like. If anything, it just jumps up a fifth rather than pitching towards it. So once that was clear, I was like, okay, let's, instead of doing pitch, we just take a very frequency-rich kind of sample and then put a bandpass on it. And as you go faster and slower, you just move where the band is and make them wider and close to go over hills and do all these things with just EQs. That has the advantage that everything still sounds great, because you don't get these pitch differences. And that immediately gave us the impression of this is what a coaster sounds like. This is metal on metal going faster and slower. So that was how we did that. And that all results in one of my favorite recordings that somebody did from a coaster and put online. A coaster going through tunnels, which also shows you kind of the reflection system of walls and the swooshes that go by. It kind of combines everything, except for crowds. There's no crowd on this one. So the last thing I want to talk about is going onto the work floor. When I started at Frontier, they gave me this really cool room with its own speaker systems, and it had a recording booth at the back of it, and it had a glass wall, and we all love glass walls because you can see outside, except that they don't sound great. But it was fantastic because it let me concentrate and do my work, and it was really good. And when I went to Planet Coaster, they changed into a desk on the floor, and the reason for that, and 2 headphones, very important. The reason for that was that I didn't feel close enough to the team to actually understand what they were working at. And being on the floor gives you a couple of really nice bonuses. One of it is people come find you. When they have a conversation that just spontaneously starts somewhere, they see you sitting there, or they remember you sitting there, they come grab you and be part of that conversation. And when they walk by, they see you work with Wise, and they go, oh, what is that? That's where the second headphone comes in. You just let them listen to what you're doing. And you can also spy on others, which is nice. You can see on their screens what they're working on and get inspired. And I sit very close to production, so I always hear what they're talking about and what problems they're facing. And I can take that back to the rest of the sound design team, who are in their own rooms and who are kind of doing their work. But it's not all kind of nice. It is also much harder to concentrate when you're on the work floor. It's just a fact. I do have closed back headphones, but headphones aren't great for mixing. So you still need a dedicated mixing space. And at the end of the project, I got really sucked into this atmosphere of, yeah, we're releasing this. So way too close to the release date, I was still doing the most minute UI sounds that we really didn't need for the game, because it was so cool to be on the work floor. And Jim, our head of audio, came to me and said, yeah, shouldn't you be mixing? What are you doing here? So he kicked me out and said to start mixing. So there's definitely a lesson learned for me in this. But overall, I'd say it is really helpful. If there's any way that you can spend some of your time on the work floor and some of your time in a dedicated mixing space, that is kind of the best of both worlds. So hopefully there were some interesting things said, and there's some things that might be handy for you. Pre-release was essential to our ambition to make a theme park sound like a theme park, and all the sounds come from the theme park that the players have built. We did a lot of thought experiments, and we shared these all the time with leads and at stand-ups. So we talked about what we were thinking about, and this made others involved in the process. When they heard something, it wasn't the first time they heard about it, and that helps as well. Buy-in from the rest of the team, constant communication. If the first time you're going to someone is to ask them to change what they're doing, they're probably not going to be too happy about that, especially not when you get very close to release. So if you're constantly talking to people, even just go to somebody and say, that's really cool what you're working on. People like that. I like that. So audio coders, absolutely essential to managing scale. I actually do not understand how they did Andromeda with one audio coder. That's a question I would love to ask. And in our case, they enabled creativity. They kept kind of the scope of the project in check, and they kept the performance in check. That meant that towards the end of the project, we didn't just do kind of performance things. This one comes from Duncan. The best microphone is the one you have with you. We used a lot of our phone recordings, and I have one of these little microphones that I always have on me called an Instamic, and just always have a microphone with you. Record on your phone. Don't care about the quality, just use what you have. Care about the quality in the end product though. In our projects, every team member owns part of that part of the game. So whoever works on crowd owns the entire crowd. Other people can work on it, but because they own it, they know where they want to go with it. And that's really handy. The design flow, doing video iterations, gives you trailers. I'm running a bit late, so I'll speed this up. Also design your systems with an eye on future projects. If a system is too large to do now, can you break it up into smaller parts? Having dedicated QA was super handy for us, and I think as these games grow larger, especially open world games, having somebody that from the start to the finish knows what your game sounds like, knows how Wise works, is really, really handy. And we're hiring, we've hired 2 more. And be heard and be seen. Be a part of the project, not just somebody that comes in at the end. Thank you very much. 4 seconds to spare.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
We are slightly over time, so I'm going to say, if it's okay with you, if people want to come and ask you, I mean, there's tons of questions, I'm sure, for this. So maybe if you can just be around and people can come and talk to you.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, let's thank him again, and we'll see you back here in a quarter of an hour.